Okay, I'm going to start. Today's shir is going to be a lot, I'm hoping, depending on how much time things will take, to do a lot of little things. A lot of little things that will kind of, in the end, all come together. But there's a lot of little snippets and tidbits in the second half of this first chapter of Shoftim. And the goal is to try to both understand what they're telling us, see the broader challenges, as well as perhaps see if there's a theme or a thread that links it all together. So that's our ambitious goal for today. Whatever we don't finish today, we will, Mitzvah Hashem, have to finish next week. So let's begin. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can everybody see the source page on the screen?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Should be the same one that's in the chat. So if somebody will keep an eye on that and just copy and paste it again if anybody new comes into the chat and asks for it. I'm going to give it one more copy right now. And then, all right. So we are here in Shoftim Perek Aleph. Last week we spoke about the opening story of Yehuda and Shimon and the conquest of Bezek, and then 2 weeks ago, and then last week we talked about Shimon and their unique relationship to the land of Israel in terms of the tribes and the cities and the story of Baal-Por. I'm not going to rehash it now. We are in our study of this first parak. We were here at the end of the story of Bezek, and what appears next from Pasuk Chet, beginning of this paragraph, Parshia, Pasuk Chet through Pasuk Tet Vav, is literally verbatim copy and paste a piece of the story that appears in Sefer Yoshua. Yehuda conquers in the south. It's in the beginning of the story of Yehuda's conquest of the tribal territory that belongs to him in after the urgent call by Yehoshua in Perikid Gimel. We have Vayachamu b'nei Dab Yerushalayim, and I'm going to come back to Yerushalayim in a few minutes. Judah fights in Yerushalayim and conquers it, and then he heads south, and he heads to Negev, and he goes into the area of Hebron. And from Hebron, we have this kind of a sidebar story. Hebron is given to Kalev. Kalev was the one who conquered it, who inherited it from the story of the tribes, and it was conquered by Othniel ben Kenaz. Othniel ben Kenaz then marries Kalev's daughter, and there's a whole kind of conversation. All of this is literally verbatim copy and post from Yeshua. And I'm not going to re-engage in review it because it really belongs there. It's here just because it's part of the story of the conquest of Judah, right? The whole story, the whole parak is the conquest of Judah. So this little piece of it is mentioned there as well. What I want to start with is this pasuk Ted Zayin, and then from there we will move to the story of Yerushalayim. Into this story of Yehuda's conquest in the south and Judah and Shimon's conquest of the areas further south, in which are the cities given to Shimon, as we talked about last week, we find a kind of parenthetical insert of a statement, and that is Uvnei Keni, Choten Moshe, Alu me'ir hatmarim et bnei Yehuda. The children or the descendants of Keni is a tribe associated maybe with descendants of Cain. Unclear that name connects, but possibly. Choten Moshe. Now, he translates here as Moshe's brother-in-law, which creates a huge question as to who the Choten is. Choten Moshe is also referred to Yitro as Choten Moshe, as father-in-law, brother-in-law. In the Torah, the word for in-law, whether it be father-in-law, brother-in-law, son-in-law, is all the same. Right? It's all choten or chatan. So it's exactly who we are referring to in this case is less clear, but for now it is the descendants of Yitro / Ruel / Keni of some kind, one of that family, Choten Moshe, Alu me'ir Tamarim. They went up from Ir HaTamarim, the palm tree city. Exactly what city is called Ir HaTamarim, we'll see in a second. And they went with Judah. Et b'nei Yehuda means with Judah. To Midbar Yehuda, south into Midbar Yehuda, Asher b'Negev Arad, the area of Arad, south of Arad. Vayelech vayeshev et ha'am. And they went and lived amongst the people. That's the story. And then the text continues with Yehuda and Shimon together going further southward to Aza and Ashkelon and Ekron and Kalev and Hebron, and it gets Hebron, and that's the end of the story. Pasuk Chaf. So what is this interjection here of Uvnei Keni Choten Moshe Alu me'ir Tamarim et bnei Yehuda? Why is it here? Who are they? What are they doing? What's the story about? So the first thing to recognize, let's first identify what Ir HaTamarim is. So Ir HaTamarim is not a mystery. Ir HaTamarim is a name for a very specific city. Anybody know what city it is?
Yericho.
Yericho, correct. And it's clearly stated so in a number of places, although for some reason the Mefarshim have a debate as to what city it refers to, but Yericho is clearly called Ir HaTamarim. You have such a reference in Devarim, Parak Lamed Daled, that the Negev at the Kikar, Bikat Yericho, Ir HaTamarim Ad Tzoar, the plain of the city of Yericho, city of palm trees. And if you've been to Yericho, you understand why Yericho is a city of palm trees. Yericho sits on a underground source of water that feeds the oasis in the desert of that is Yericho, Ir HaTamarim. And that's so. How did Bnei Keni come to Ir HaTamarim? How did they get to Yericho? When did they get to Yericho? And why did they leave Yericho? That's the bigger question. Let's assume for the moment we don't know when they came to Yericho, but let's assume for the moment that they did. When did they leave Yericho and go into this and go southward into the area of Negev Arad? And the Mefarshim pick up on this connection between the descendants of Keni, Choten Moshe, and the fact that they end up in Negev Arad, southward. It's not Arad today, it's even further south. What's going on here? So if I look, for example, at what happened here? Put in all the sources, we didn't get to the Mefarshim. Okay, let's take a look at the Rav Yosef Kara, Marie Kara. Bnei Keni Choten Moshe Alu me'ir HaTamarim et bnei Yehuda midbar Yehuda asher b'Negev Arav. So first of all, he tells us this Arad, hu Arad shekatuv b'Torah, v'yishma Knani melech Arad yoshev Negev. The first thing that rings a bell in the Mefarshim, in the commentaries, is that Arad in the Negev, which may or may not be Arad of today, let's assume for a moment, is actually a very interesting juxtaposition for us because, again, we have this reference to Bnei Keni going from Ir HaTamarim, which is Yericho, to southward into the area of Negev Arad. Well, Negev Arad is mentioned in the Chumash. Negev Arad is referred to specifically in Bamidbar Parak of Aleph. It's a very dramatic moment in the Chumash. Vayishma HaKna'ani melech Arad yoshev Negev ki ba Yisrael, as Israel, as they're leaving Egypt and they come around, they come near the area of Melech, the Canaanite king of Arad, who comes to fight with them, Vayilachem Yisrael vayesh mimenu shevi, and they took captives amongst them. Meaning that the Canaanites captured from amongst the Israelites and took them hostage, which is a modus operandi that we are familiar with, and I don't mean contemporary, that's all a different story, but we're familiar with in Tanakh from the story of Amalek. And this area of Melech Arad Yoshev HaNegev is not far from the area of Amalek in the south as well. Amalek is in the Negev, that we know from Pashat Shlach. And the notion of placing the Keni into the Negev, in the area of Melech Arad, or in the area near the tribal territory of Amalek, already rings a bell and is somewhat of a red light that goes off. The notion, the connection between Amalek and the descendants and the tribal territory of Keni is not an accident. For example, in Parshat Balak, Bilam specifically, at the end of the entire episode, where he tries to bless the people and he ends up cursing them, and then it says, Vayarat Amalek, he goes through nation after nation and tells that some nevuah related to each of the nations in the area. He mentions Moab. Then he turns to Amalek and he says, Vayarat Amalek, Vayamar. He looked at Amalek and he said, Reshit Goyim Amalek, first amongst the nations. Some debate whether that means the first to attack Israel. And his future will be destruction. He will be destroyed. Next verse. Vayar et hakeni, vayisa mishalo vayamar. He saw the keni, and he said, "Eitan moshavecha v'sibasela kinecha. Your dwelling place is strong. Your nest is in the rock. Nevertheless, keni shall be waste. Nonetheless, ki kain adma ashur tishbeka, until Ashur carries you away the captive." Whatever the reference here is, the juxtaposition of Amalek and Keni places us once again in the connection between the descendants of Yitro, or the descendants of Keni, and Amalek, which is exactly where the story of Yitro begins. In Parshat Yitro, Yitro comes to Israel on the heels of the end of Parshat Beshalach, which is the battle of Amalek. Hence, Chazal asked the question, what did Yitro hear that he came? And one of the explanations is that he heard of the battle of Amalek. He heard what Israel did to Amalek. There is a medrash, very strange medrash, that Yitro in his earlier days was an officer in the army of Amalek. What the connection between Chazal keep trying to find a deep connection between Yitro and Amalek. Not hard to find it, because in fact, they are physically both in the south. They are Midian is in the south, not far from Amalek. If you remember the story of the shepherds who challenged Yitro's daughters at the well, there's a suggestion that they were from Bnei Amalek. And so the notion of, again, the only question is when did they come to Irat Tamarim? When did they come to Yericho? And when do they leave Yericho and head southward back to maybe their old roots, which are near Amalek? And that's essentially what the suggestion of Rav Yosef Kara is. They left Yericho, right? The fat, the produce of Yericho, the green of Yericho. And they went to dwell southward in the desert region of, or in the cities of the region of the Negev, Midbar Yehuda, Asher Negev Arad. And they did so. Why? Well, he doesn't explain why yet. Okay, I'll come to why. I'll come to this reference in a second. Question of why he leaves at this time. Okay, but that's reference information purposes. We know that they leave Yericho and they head south to Midbar Yehuda with the rest of the tribe of Judah. But once they're in the south, says Rav Yosef Karo, they are now back in proximity to Amalek, right? And Amalek is in the Negev, or south of Israel. If you remember the story in Sefer Shmuel, one of the cities of Judah that eventually gets settled by David HaMelech is the city of Tziklag, in southern region of Yehuda. Tziklag was the city that Amalek attacked at the end of Sefer Shmuel Aleph. So Amalek is always there in the south. The Plishtim are on the coast. Amalek is in the south. And suddenly this Keni, the Bnei Keni, they leave the area of Yericho and they head south. When they head south, they are now back in proximity to their old alliance, possibly with Amalek. Why is that relevant? Says Rav Yosef Karo, read a little further. Let's keep jumping. Where does it go? Shalot titma. Therefore, don't be dismayed. Don't be surprised. Kishatak Koreh, when you read later on of Shaul, Vayomer Shaul Lakini Lechusuru Redum Amaleki. When Shaul requests of the Kini to leave the proximity of Amalek. What is he referring to here? So that's the other reference to Kini. The other reference to Kini is in Sefer Shmuel Aleph. When Shaul goes to battle against Amalek, before he starts the campaign against Amalek in the Negev, he says to Vayomer Shaul El HaKeni, you need to separate yourself from a Korach, right? So when Moshe warns everybody to leave the proximity of the tents of Korach, right? That's exactly what Shaul says to the Kini, leave the proximity of Amalek because pen osivcha imo, lest you be destroyed with them. You were kind to Israel when they left Mitzrayim. Story of Yitro and Moshe. It's the same family. Vayasar Keni mitach Amalek, and that's what they do. They got up and they departed from their proximity to Amalek and left Amalek alone to fight against Shaul and for Shaul to eventually win that campaign. So says Yosef Kari, that's exactly what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a moment in which Bnei Keni, Choten Moshe, left the proximity of Irat Remi Yericho, and they went down to settle with Midbar Yehuda, with Yehuda in the Midbar in the south, B'Negev Arad, close to their old alliance with Amalek, adds of Yosef, adds the Marikara, and most of them are Farshim, linking our story to what we come to Metz later, which is that the Keni are down in the south near Amalek. So this migration here is a foreshadowing of what will happen later, and that foreshadowing is the theme of the entire parak. Each one of these stories has some element of foreshadowing of events to come. One additional observation, where Yosef Kara doesn't explain why they left the comfort of Yericho, if you will. So the Malbim adds one piece, and he says, these Bnei Keni were a nomadic tribe. They were Yoshev Ohel. They were nomads, which is typical of the Shevet Midyan. That's exactly what you have with the Midianites. Vayalem Shalom Yisrael. They were at peace with Israel, certainly from the days of Yitro. Ube'et lacham Yehuda im Knaani, when Yehuda started the campaign against the Canaanites in the south, alu me'irat Tamarim shaya b'makom milchama. So Yericho was right smack in the middle. The area around Yericho was in the middle of the campaign. If Judah is heading from Yerushalayim southward into Midbar Yehuda, into the area of Hebron and Devir and Lachi, all the major cities, right? Yericho is right in the middle of the campaign. And so rather than to be caught up in that battle, they got up and left. ונתיישבו במדבר יהודה וישב את העם בברית שלום ובהשקט. So they went southwards and they dwelt amongst Judah, וישב את העם, with the people in peaceful relations. כמו שעשה שאול את לחם עם עמלק, ויאמר לקני סורו רדו מתוך עמלקי, כן היה אתה. Similar to what Shaul offered to Amalek when he offered to Keni when he went to fight Amalek. In other words, to put the story together, it would seem that Yitro, or the descendants of Yitro, the descendants of this Keni tribe, were living in Israel. How they got to there? How did they get to the area of Yericho? How did they get to to Israel altogether. They're sitting in the midbar. They're sitting in Midian. So unless you want to talk about Yitro and these are descendants of Yitro, and Yitro comes to convert at Mount Har Sinai, problematic conversation because they're not considered Israelites. They're considered a separate tribe. They're considered Bnei Keni. So from a conversion perspective, they're not really in that category. Maybe Yitro himself converted, unclear. But the simpler explanation, if I take you back to Chumash, to a conversation that appears in Parshat Ba'alotcha, where they're about to travel for the first time, leaving Har Sinai and traveling towards the land of Israel. This is 2 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim. They're now literally the first time the Mishkan is going to be broken down, the Shekhinah, the cloud is starting to move, and they are ready to go. The first half of this parak deals with literally the breakdown of the Mishkan and the travel of the Degel tribe by tribe. And into that moment, Vayomer Moshe lechovav ben Reuel Midyani choten Moshe. Moshe says to Chovav ben Reuel, the Midianite, choten Moshe, again, choten Moshe, brother-in-law, father-in-law. And he says to this descendant from Midian, Nosim anachnu lamakom asher amar Hashem oto eten lachem. We're heading to the land of Israel. We're heading to the promised land. L'cha itanu ve'etavnu lach. Come with us, and we will be good to you. Ki Hashem diber tova Yisrael. God has spoken good for Israel. Vayomer elav. Initially, Chovav's response is Lo elech. I'm not going. Ki im el artzi ve'el moladati elech. I have to go home. Vayomer. To which Moshe then interjects, and he says, and he pleads with Chovav, Vayomer al na tazov otanu, don't leave us. You can be eyes for us in the desert. Ve'ayaki telech imanu, ve'ayah hatov hahu asher yitiv Hashem imanu ve'itavnu lach. The good that God will bestow upon us, we will bestow upon you. Mysterious, enigmatic comment, to which there is no response, because the next verse is Vayisum Hashem. So the suggestion that is made, again, it's a machloket of the Mefarshim, Radak, and others. Is this Yitro? Is it not Yitro? Did Yitro go back? Did Yitro stay with Moshe? What was Chovav's response? Did Chovav agree to go with them? Did he not agree? But let's assume for the moment that they agreed. And again, he's a Midianite. It's not clear that they're part of Israel. The B'nai Brit, they certainly are in alliance or in peaceful relations with Israel. But Moshe promises him a portion of whatever the Tov is that we are going to be receiving. Nosim anachnu al makom asher amar Hashem eten lachem l'cha itanu ve'hetavnu lach. You were good to us, we'll be good to you. In other words, whatever land we got, which is the Tov, we will give you a portion. And the assumption is that is exactly the story that we're dealing with here, that they came with Moshe, Bnei Israel. They settled in Irat Marim. At the moment Irat Marim became engulfed in the battles of the south, they moved from Irat Marim. Where did they go? They went southward to Bnei Yehuda, and from there they rediscovered an old alliance, namely the proximity to Amalek. And so as time progresses, they are in peaceful relations with Israel, but they are also in proximity physically to the nomads. They're now living in the south, near Amalek, and eventually they become part of the story of Amalek / Keni in the battle with Shaul. That's part one of that story. Part two, which is very briefly, I'll just mention, but I think it's important, is this explanation explains one of the more enigmatic verses later in Sefer Shoftim. What am I referring to? Let's take a quick glance forward. Now, we're going to be doing this a lot in this year, maybe next week too. From this parak forward, this parak back too, but this parak seems to foreshadow events that are going to take place. So bear in mind, we're dealing with Bnei Keni, Choten Moshe, We're now in the south. Now take a look at a verse in Shoftim Perek Daled. Shoftim Perek Daled is years later. It's the story of Sisera and the army of Canaan in Emek Israel. It's the story of Barak, the story of Devorah, right? Devorah is the Nevi'ah who fights with Barak against the army of Sisera. And in the middle of that battle, Sisera gets off his chariot and he runs. The battle begins. וחבר הקני נפרד מקין, מבני חובב חותן משה. Chever, the Keni, the Kenite, right, from the word Cain, had separated himself from the rest of the tribe of Cain, of Keni. They were of the descendants of Chovav, Choten Moshe, same family we're dealing with, and had planted his tent, or had pitched his tent, in the north, because this battle is all happening in Emek Israel. Fast forward a few verses. Sisera, in the midst of the battle, gets off his horse and he runs. Sisera nas biraglav. Sorry, I skipped a verse. Sisera nas biraglav el ohel Yael eshet chever hakeni. Sisera gets off his chariot and he runs on foot, and he runs straight into the tent of Yael, the wife of Chever Hakeni, who had separated from Cain and went north. Ki shalom ben Yavin melech Hatzor uven bet Chever Hakeni. There was peaceful relations, there was alliance between Yavin, the king of Hatzor, who was the enemy of Israel at this time, and the house of Chever Hakeni. And Yael goes out and she brings him into her tent, and the rest of the story we'll get to when we get to Perek Dalet. So on the one hand, Chever HaKeni is up in the north, and he's separated from the rest of the tribe of Keni. So who is this Chever HaKeni, and who is Yael Eshet Chever HaKeni? And we'll unpack all of this when we get to Perek Dalet. But for our purposes, the Radak links these stories directly. In Shoftim, Perek Dalet, he writes, Ki nifrad, what does it mean? Chever HaKeni nifrad mikayin, says the Radak, nifrad mimidbar Yehuda sheyeshvu sham bnei Keni kisha'alu me'ir tamarim. It's the same separation, the same migration. The original migration of the Keni tribe comes, Choten Moshe comes and settles in Ir Tamarim and Yericho when Bnei Yisrael come into the land of Israel. As the war begins, they leave the area of Yericho and they head. Now we know that they split. They head south into the area of proximity to Amalek and reestablish ties with Amalek. But a part of them head north and reestablish ties with the Knaani, because that's right, they were a Midianite tribe. And so Chever HaKeni nifrad mikayin, was separated from the rest of the tribe of Cain. When they went south, he went north. And suddenly, this story of Bnei Keni is a foreshadowing. It's telling us this is a setup for our understanding of events that will come in the future. Namely, it'll help us understand the Chever HaKeni in the story of Devorah and Yael, and it'll help us understand Shaul and his engagement with Bnei Keni in the south by Amalek, and it'll help us understand that these Bnei Keni, they are not Bnei Yisrael, they're not part of our tribe. They have a quasi-peaceful relationship with Bnei Yisrael, but on the other hand, they also have peaceful relations with Yavin Chatzor, who is a Canaanite king. They have peaceful relations with Amalek, and you never know where to trust them, where not to trust them. And that's the story of Bnei Keni. They're a mystery, but they're a mystery of a Midianite nomadic tribe sitting in the midst of Israel. And that's the first foreshadowing of the theme of the Perek, which is these kind of enclaves of non-Israelite tribes, whether Midianite, Keni, or rather Canaanite, that are now amongst us, and we have to figure out what relationship we have with them. And so our story begins here. Okay, that's part one. The rest of the conquest of Judah in the south, we already addressed, so we're going to skip, and that brings us to Pasuk Chaf Aleph. And now I begin to look at the rest of the story. So I promised you an address to the question of Yerushalayim. Somebody asked it a couple of weeks ago. There's a reference earlier to Yerushalayim as well. Okay, we're into a new topic now. That was topic number. There's a bunch of subtopics, little topics today. So I just want to make clear. Pasuk Chet, when Judah was fighting in the south, it says, "Vayilachamu b'nei Yehuda b'Yerushalayim, vayilkedu ota." They fought against Yerushalayim, they conquered it. Vayakul lefi they struck it. Ve'atayir shulchu ba'esh, and they set the city on fire. And then we find half a chapter later, "Ve'atayevusi yoshev Yerushalayim lo harishu b'nei Binyamin." The Jebusites in Yerushalayim, the children of Binyamin were unable to, or did not, drive out. Vayeshev hayevusi et bnei Binyamin b'Yerushalayim ad hayom hazeh. And the Jebusites therefore remained amongst bnei Binyamin in Yerushalayim until this day. So there's several questions that jump off the page on this verse right away. The first is, they conquered Yerushalayim. They didn't conquer Yerushalayim? What happened here?
Yeah.
That's the first question. And the second question, which the Mefarshim raise, is this, you see, Yoshev Yerushalayim suddenly is the story of Binyamin, whereas earlier Yerushalayim was conquered by Judah. And we'll see a verse in Sefer Yeshua as well, that the Jebusites were not conquered by Judah. So who didn't conquer the Jebusites? Did Binyamin not conquer them, or did Yehuda not conquer them? Right? That's the other question. So this is just on the Mefarshim. The questions are obvious. I'll do a quick review of the Mefarshim. Take a look, for example, the Radak. So the first question, actually, let's do the first question first, or the second question first, which is either they conquered Yerushalayim or they didn't conquer Yerushalayim. What does it mean? They conquered Yerushalayim, but then the Jebusites they didn't conquer. So one possibility is Machoz haya b'Yerushalayim sheshmo Yevusi. Medrash from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, it's quoted by Rashi, quoted by the Radak and by other Mefarshim as well, that there's a separation, the distinction to be made between Yerushalayim and the Jebusites of Yerushalayim. The Jebusite is the fortress of Yerushalayim, what is referred to later as Mitzudat David, right? The Mitzudah or the Tzinor, or what David eventually conquers and calls Ir David. That's a hill, and it's a city with a wall on top of the hill. So between the combination of the hill and the wall, it's a fortress. That area, which is referred to as the Yevusi, or the city of the Jebusites, that never gets conquered, not by Judah, not by Binyamin. That doesn't get conquered until David HaMelech. But Yerushalayim isn't just a city. Yerushalayim is a region. And the region and the cities and the suburbs around it are part of what Judah conquers as he makes his way south. So that's one explanation, a very simple explanation. The other possibility, and I mention it only because from a Pshat perspective, it might be more accurate, let's say, or more directly connected to the Pshat, which is that they conquer Yerushalayim. Some Mefarshim suggest they conquer Yerushalayim and then they move on. They never settle Yerushalayim because they're yet unaware of the historical and future significance of Yerushalayim. And so Yerushalayim for them is just another city. And like many of the cities, they conquer and then the Canaanites resettle because they don't settle themselves in the areas that they conquered. So they conquered Yerushalayim, they moved southward, and then the Jebusites came back. That's another possibility if Yerushalayim is in fact referring specifically to the hilltop that we refer to as Ir David. The other interesting question is, again, and that's also addressed to the Mefarshim, is who didn't conquer Yerushalayim? What do I mean by that? If you look at the verse we just read, that Yevusi Yoshev Yerushalayim, Lo Harishu B'nai Binyamin, the Jebusites who dwelt in Yerushalayim. Again, if Yerushalayim is just that city, just the fortress, then you have to assume that Yerushalayim was conquered and then the Jebusites resettled. But B'nai Binyamin do not conquer; they do not settle. Lo Harishu B'nai Binyamin. The Jebusites continue to dwell amongst Bnei Binyamin in Yerushalayim until today, meaning until the authorship of the Sefer, which is written by Shmuel Hanavi. In Yoshua, Parak Vav, we read the identical verse. And there it said, V'et haYevusi, Yoshvei Yerushalayim, lo yochlu b'nei Yehuda lo risham. Judah was unable to drive them out. Vayeshev haYevusi et b'nei Yehuda b'Yerushalayim. The Jebusites dwelt amongst Judah in Yerushalayim. It's the identical verse. The only difference is one word, maybe lo yochlu versus lo rishu, but the only real difference is one's talking about Yehuda, one's talking about Binyamin. So what's the answer? The answer is very simple, but we just have to be aware of it. Yerushalayim is exactly the border city, and here's a map, right? Yerushalayim is the border city between Judah in the south and Binyamin to the north. Yerushalayim is literally split down the middle. And so, like many challenges at that time, it fell to both tribes to figure out. Right? Borders in Tanakh are not lines drawn on a map. They're cities. So Yerushalayim is associated with the tribe of Judah. Yerushalayim is associated with the tribe of Binyamin. Who's responsible for conquering Yerushalayim? So Bnei Yehuda says, and Yerushalayim is a major, difficult challenge to conquer. Let's say the Jebusite fortress is a major, difficult challenge to conquer. David HaMelech will have to use all the ingenuity available to eventually conquer it, and he does so for a reason. What does Judah say? Judah says, of Yerushalayim, or of the Yevusi, lo yochlu lo risham, they're too difficult. And you know what? I've got bigger issues right now. I'm heading south. I'm heading to Beit Lechem, heading to Hebron, heading to Devir, heading to Lachish, to Eglon, to Ashkelon. I don't have time to deal with Yerushalayim. Binyamin, you deal with Yerushalayim. In the meantime, Binyamin in the south, dealing with the conquest of Giv'on and Beit El and Ai, and we'll see other cities, they don't have the ability to conquer the most difficult hill and most difficult fortress in the whole region. So they turned to Judah and they said, you deal with it. So Yehuda doesn't conquer it from the south, and Binyamin doesn't conquer it from the north, and each one essentially turns to the other and says, okay, you deal with it. Ends up that up until the time of David HaMelech, Yerushalayim remains a Jebusite fortress, and Yerushalayim is what I would call the no man's land between the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Binyamin. Why is that important? Because for David HaMelech, it was crucial. David spent the latter half of his time in the life of Shaul. There was when Shaul kind of turns against David, it ends up with a major civil war. And that civil war, the fault line between the tribes of Judah, the tribe of Judah who followed David, and the tribe of Binyamin and Ephraim who followed Shaul and his descendants, Ishbosheth, that fault line was Yerushalayim. It was the border between the tribes of Binyamin to the north and all the tribes that followed Shaul and Yehuda in the south. And so when it fell to David to unite the tribes after the death of Shaul and the fall of Shaul and Ishbosheth, he comes to and conquers Yerushalayim specifically because it had been unconquered territory. It was the border between Yehuda and Binyamin, and by putting his capital and his malchus in Yerushalayim, he unites the tribe of Binyamin and Yehuda together because Yerushalayim now becomes the border city between two warring factions that unite the tribes together. Ki ir shechubila yachdav. So that's a foreshadowing of an event much later in history, but again, it's referenced here. Okay. Part 2. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
All right. Now let's go back to the text. So we're moving forward through this parak. We dealt with Yud and Shimon. We dealt with the interlude of the Keni. Now we dealt with Binyamin, who's able to conquer. And actually, what I'm going to do at this point is be helpful if I have a map. No, that's not going to help me. And we're going to do something creative. Oh, not what I wanted to do. 1 second. That's what I wanted to do. Okay. Whoops. Sorry about that. Where am I? There I am. Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. We're going to solve this right now. Perfect. That's exactly where I wanted to be. Okay. Vayalu Beit Yosef. Can anybody see both screens? Excellent. Vayalu Beit Yosef. Next, Binyamin conquers their territory, pretty much everything except Yerushalayim. This is a map we're going to see a lot of. This map is essentially the map of the period of time of Yeshua and Shoftim, and parts of Shmuel as well. Everything that's in orange is tribal Israelite. Everything that's yellow is more or less Canaanite and or others. So it kind of gives you a sense of what the areas of Israelite settlement looked like in the time of Yeshua and Shoftim. Okay, there's a lot to be said for this. Vayalu Beit Yosef gam hem Beit El, v'Hashem imam. Beit Yosef, they too went to Beit El, and God was with them. God was with them, meaning they were successful in the conquest of Beit El. Who is Beit Yosef? Ephraim and or Menashe. Beit Yosef is combined tribes of Ephraim and Menashe. Vayatiru Beit Yosef beVeit El. They sent spies into the city of Beit El, from the word Latur, Vayaturu. V'shem ha'ir lefanim Luz. The name of the city was originally Luz. So these spies, they saw a watchman come out of the city. Tell us, how do we enter the city? We'll spare your life. Story similar to the story of Rachav. So he showed them exactly how to enter the city, how to conquer the city. Israel conquers the city of Beit El, aka Luz, by the sword. And the man, and the man they let go, because that's what they promised, they will let him escape. So the man ran off to the land of the Chittim, which is more or less up north, all the way up north, today modern Turkey. He built a new city, and he called it Luz. I like to call it New Luz. You understand the reference, right? Hushma ad hayom hazeh, and that's its name till today. Very simple story, more or less. Two interesting things about the story that are caught on my attention. First of all, it doesn't say whether we're dealing with Ephraim or Menashe. We're heading north from Judah. We went to Binyamin. We're heading north to Beit El, which seems to be the tribal territory of Ephraim. That would make sense. And it tells us that Beit El, God was with Yosef. When they conquered Beit El, God was with him. The notion of describing Yosef's success as God was with him, Hashem Imam, is very familiar to us. Where else have we encountered that phrase before? That phrase is essentially tied to the story of Yosef. Yosef.
In Vayeshev, yeah.
Right, that is tied to the story of Yosef's success. Vayi Hashem et Yosef. God was with Yosef when he went to Egypt. Vayi ish matzliach, and he was successful in the house of Potiphar or in the Beit Zohar. Vayi Hashem et Yosef. Right, God was with him, and Chesed, the Sabit Sohar. The notion that in the context of Yosef, you have this theme that God's presence, God's support, God's help is described as Vayi Hashem et imam, or God was with them. That's one piece of the story. The other piece of the story, which is very important for us to understand, is Beit El. Is this the Beit El that we're talking about? Beit El is mentioned in Sefer Breshit many times. In fact, the notion of the connection between Beit El and Luz has its roots in Sefer Breshit. If I go back to Perek Yud Bet for a moment, we'll leave these two maps. Go to Perek Yud Bet. We find that Abraham, when he comes into the land of Israel, first place he comes to is the city of Shechem, and so he's headed south from the city of Shechem. He's coming down from Haran, comes to Shechem. Vayera Hashem et Avram, and he says to him, "I'll give you this land," and builds a mizbeach. And from there he heads south. Vayatek misham ha'ara, mikedem lebeit El. Vayet oalo ben Beit El miyam v'ha'ai mikedem. And he pitches his tent between Beit El to his west and Ai to his east. If we go back to the map, you can see that Beit El miyam v'ha'ai mikedem, Ai and Beit El are very close together. Ai of the city familiar with Sefer Yeshua. And this is more or less would put Abraham in a straight line. From Shechem, he's heading straight down to the area of Beit El. And then from there, he'll head further south to Hebron and then to Mitzrayim. Yaakov's journey, on the other hand, is in the other direction. Yaakov is heading north. Yaakov is going from Beersheba, Yaakov Beersheba vayelech Charana, and as he comes to the areas he's heading out of the country, we find Yaakov also comes to a place. And he names the place Beit El. That's the story of Yaakov's dream. And you have it in Perek Chaf Chet. Vayira v'yomar Yaakov, when he wakes up from his dream, Yaakov Mishnato, v'yomer achen yesh Hashem v'makom hazeh manachil yadati, there is God in this place and I didn't know. And he said, how wondrous, how awesome this place is. Beit Elokim. This is the house of God. This is the gates of heaven. Yaakov gets up in the morning and he takes a stone and he places it in his head and he puts a matzeva. Okay. And he names the place Beit El, which is of course strange because why is it strange that Yaakov names the place Beit El? So somebody speak up. Why is it strange that Yaakov names the place Beit El?
Because it was called Beit El before.
Abraham landed in the city of Beit El. He pitched his tent between Beit El and Ai. So assuming we're dealing with the same Beit El, you could argue that it gets its name later and it's just a kind of called that earlier because we know what it will eventually be called. Nonetheless, but the city was first called Luz, which is referenced here and not referenced in the story of Abraham. Hence, the big question is the Beit El of Abraham and the Beit El of Yaakov the same city? Everybody seems to assume it is. I'm not sure that's correct. And at least one approach in the Mefarshim suggests that it's not correct. I want to see if it's here. There's one source that's not on your source page, and I just want to. Oh, am I going to run into that problem? Down here. I'll show you a simple way of looking at it. Take a look at Yoshua Perek Tet Zayin. ויצא הגורל לבני יוסף מירדן יריחו למאיר ידי מזרחה, the tribal territory of Yosef from the Yarden eastward, or the Yarden on the east, המדבר עולה מיריחו בהר בית אל, the mountain goes up into the region over בית אל, ויצא מבית אל לוזה, and it heads the border from Beit El to Luz. What's the problem?
Beit El is Luz.
Beit El is Luz. At least that's the way we assume. And so the Gra makes the observation that was quoted by the Mitzvah David that Beit El and Luz are two different cities. The Beit El of Yaakov is not the same as the Beit El of Avraham. Beit El of Avraham is near Ai. The Beit El of Yaakov, again, it could be that he's heading to Yerushalayim, when he's heading out of the country and he comes to Chazal says he's actually in Yerushalayim, and he calls Yerushalayim Beit El. That's very odd. I mean, it's possible, but it's Rashi quotes a whole medrash to that effect. If he's in Beit El, it's also very strange, right? Why he says that this will be replaced with the So I'll tell you another possibility. That the Beit El of Yaakov is not the same as the Beit El of Avraham, and is not Yerushalayim. Where does that leave us? Shiloh. Shiloh. Yosef, it doesn't say that we're dealing with Ephraim. It says, V'yalu b'nei Yosef. It could be Ephraim, it could be Menashe. Right? What? Sorry, it could be. It doesn't say. Yeah, Shiloh is also part of Ephraim. Sorry, I forget what I just said. Scratch that sentence. Right? Shiloh is also part of Ephraim. Right? It could be Beit El. Could be Shiloh. How do I get to Shiloh? How do I get to Beit El being Shiloh? So take a look. This is the source. Back to the source page. Shmuel Aleph Perek Yud. This is Shaul and Shmuel having a conversation. Shmuel designates Shaul. He tells Shaul, he meets him for the first time, and he's going to tell him that he's going to be the new king, or the first king, and he's going to have certain events occur that are prophetically predicted as a way of demonstrating to Shaul that Shmuel is an authentic Navi and that his words are going to are true. Okay, that's all background. Here's the sentence. You're going to head wherever you're going, to the city of Elon Tavor. You're going to find three people. Olim el Elokim Beit El. They're going up to God to Beit El. One is carrying 3 gediyim, 3 sheep, 3 kids. One is carrying flour. One is carrying wine, meaning they're going to bring korbanot. Where are they going to bring korbanot in the days of Shmuel? In Beit El. Why are they going to Beit El?
Yeah.
They should be going to Shiloh. Unless you assume that Beit El is Shiloh. Or another example, in Shoftim, Perek Chaf, at the end of Sefer Shoftim, we have the story of Pelegish Begiva, which is actually a much earlier story, but it appears at the end of the Sefer. And there, they're about to engage in a battle against Binyamin, the tribes of Israel against Binyamin. Vayakumu v'yalu Beit El, they go to Beit El, vayishalu be'elokim, and they asked God, they asked the Kohen Gadol, they asked the Urim v'Tumim, vayamru b'nei Yisrael miyeh lanu b'tchila le'milchama b'nei Binyamin, who should lead us into battle against Binyamin, and God answered, Vayomer Hashem Yehuda b'tchila. We talked about this verse in the very beginning of the parak. They're in Beit El and asking the Kohen Gadol of the Urim v'Tumim. Says the Radak, Hanira b'einai, Ki al Shiloh amar. We're talking about Shiloh. Ki sham haya ha'aron. V'nikra Beit El u'Beit Elokim u'Beit Hashem. Beit El means a place for a temple, whether it's a foreign temple and hence Beit El could be a name given to many cities in the land of Israel. Any city that housed a temple would have been called Beit El, but in our case, specifically, Beit El is a reference to Shiloh. And so the possibility, when I come back to the text that we are looking at, the possibility that the reference here is to Shiloh, and if it's in Shiloh, it's an old story. It's a story of how we first conquered Shiloh. Vashem imam, God is with them, could mean here much more dramatic, much more significant than simply a reference to the fact that they were successful, but that this was about bringing the Aron, God, the house of God, the throne of God, into its home in Shiloh, which is a story in Yeshua, Parak Yud Chet. Ve'alu Beit Yosef, Kamhem Beit El, meaning Shiloh Vashem imam. Assuming this Beit El is not, again, assuming Beit El of Yaakov and the Beit El of Avram are different, and that Yaakov is Shiloh, which will explain why Shiloh was chosen as the place for the seat of the Mishkan. So far we have events that are foreshadowing the future. At the Yevusi Yoshev, story of Keni and his separation, which will eventually lead into Amalek and into the north. And we have reference to what they were unable to conquer in terms of Yerushalayim and its significance for the later story of David HaMelech. And now the story of the past, meaning the story of Beit Yosef and their conquest of Shiloh, and how they placed the Mishkan in Shiloh. And so one by one, we're going through a quick review of the events of Sefer Yoshua, but a review that gives us a foreshadowing into some of the subjects we're going to see, some of the personalities, some of the stories that we're going to encounter in Sefer Shoftim, and specifically those stories that focus on the remnants of the non-Israelite tribes in the midst of Israel, whether the Jebusites in Yerushalayim, the Canaanites who we've already seen, and now the story will continue, and we'll have to leave the rest for next week, with the story of Menashe and Ephraim and Zevulun and Asher and Naphtali and the sections of the land that they were more or less successful in acquiring. So for now, I'm going to stop here and take questions, but we're going to have to continue this subject for another shir. I apologize. I had hoped by next week to start chapter 2, but the rest of this chapter is too important for us to gloss over it, so we'll get to the rest of it, B'ezrat Hashem, next week. Okay, I'm going to stop here and take questions. Yes?
Rabbi, do you understand that Beit El is more of an experience than an actual location? And do you understand that Beit El and Beit Elokim are the same?
So what I'm suggesting is that Beit El is not an experience, Beit El is a location. That I'm convinced of. But there are more than one place called Beit El.
Right, so it sounds like an experience and not a location.
Well, no, what I'm saying, in biblical terms, you have names of cities take on the city based on what takes place in the city.
Right,
So
it's an
Beit Lechem
experience.
is a farmland.
Right.
And therefore you can have more than one city referred to as Beit Lechem. And so we have Beit Lechem Yehuda, we have Beit Lechem in the north, we have cities called Kedesh. There's at least 3 cities in the land of Israel called Kedesh. Kedesh Naphtali, there's Kedesh in the Golan. Kedesh is, again, comes to the word Kadosh. It was a city that had some kind of temple experience or ritual associated with it. You have cities like Mitzpeh today in Israel as well. Right? There are lots of cities. Any city built on a hilltop could be Mitzpeh, because Mitzpeh simply means a tatzpit, a place where you can view the valley below. So names of cities in Tanakh are given to the city based on, there are certain names, not all names, but there are certain names that are common to many cities that had certain characteristics associated with it. So Beit El is one of them. Beit El means a city that had a temple. Now, whether that was our temple or whether that was the Canaanite temple depends on who is naming the city. So Yaakov names the city Beit El because Ein Zeki im Beit Elokim. Abram encounters a city called Beit El, which is more likely a Canaanite city of Beit El. So that's an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Short answer is yes. But... Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Abba.
Why did Joshua decide to set up the Mishkan after Gilgal in Shiloh?
So that's a very interesting question. We addressed it really in Sefer Yoshua. So I can't do a whole review of it, but the short of it is that at the time of Yoshua setting the Mishkan in a place, Binyamin's territory had not yet been conquered. The real location for the Mishkan should have been in the tribe of Binyamin. That has to do with Yaakov's bracha to Binyamin. Moshe's bracha to Binyamin is Yedid Hashem and Yishkan Levetach Alav. The Shekhinah is hovering over the tribe of Binyamin. But Binyamin hadn't yet conquered his territory, and Moshe and Yeshua needed to break camp. So Shiloh becomes the best option. I'm suggesting it's because Shiloh has a historical connection from Yaakov. Beit El of Yaakov could be Shiloh. And so he moves the Mishkan there because it has a historical significance, possibly. Again, I can't prove what I've suggested today, but it's a reasonable conjecture that if you want to read it, Rabbi Dan writes about this and speaks about this in a number of places. Seems to be a possibility. So that would explain why Yoshua moves to Shiloh. It has a history back in the days of Yaakov, and where it really needs to go, which is Yerushalayim, or at least the tribe of Binyamin, isn't, quote unquote, isn't ready. So he has to put it somewhere.
And then why to Nov?
Oh, we'll get to that in Sefer Shmuel. Shiloh was destroyed by the Plishtim.
Yes.
So then he has to move. So then it goes to various places in Shevet Binyamin. No, Givon. Where it moves to after that is always in Shevet. At that point, it never leaves the tribal territory of Binyamin. But that's also just the Mizbech. The Mizbech and the Aron are split at that point. That's a whole different subject. So we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's leave that for Sefer Shmuel. Okay.
Thank you. Chodesh Tov.
Thank you.
All the best to you. Enjoy. B'ezrat Hashem. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you very much. Chodesh Tov.
Thank you, Chodesh Tov.